If you are currently confronted with these sentences, do not view it as the result of a simple algorithm, a random suggestion, or a period of idle time. At the quantum level, no encounter is without cause, and consciousness makes contact with the necessary frequency precisely when it is ready. This video did not happen to enter your life. It was drawn into your field of consciousness because the mechanism we call the observer loop has created an invisible bridge between your inner frequency and external reality. Perhaps you have noticed that you have been repeating the same thoughts for some time, circling in the same emotions, or even facing the same problems in different forms. And this situation is now causing you not only fatigue but also a sense of meaninglessness. It is precisely at this point that the first door of quantum consciousness opens. Because when consciousness can no longer bear the patterns that have reached its limit, it is forced to move to a new level of perception. The brain perceives this transition as a threat, because the brain wants to protect what it knows, while consciousness wants to expand. At this moment of conflict, a silence begins in your mind. The thoughts you once thought defined, you lose their effect. Some beliefs feel as if they are being ripped out from within, and you cannot fully explain why. However, this inexplicable situation is not a disruption, but a readjustment. In the quantum field, reality does not operate through a linear cause and effect chain. Reality changes shape according to the observer's level of awareness. While watching this video, you are not merely consuming content, but observing the current state of your own consciousness. And this observation is slowly beginning to detach you from your old timeline. Because you are no longer on autopilot, you are beginning to feel that you are watching something, not that something is watching you. This feeling makes most people uneasy because it is perceived as a loss of control. But what is actually happening is that control is shifting from the mind to consciousness. At this stage, you may experience small but strange disruptions in your life. Some people quietly distance themselves, some goals lose their appeal, and some questions become clearer than ever. All of this indicates that your frequency signature is beginning to change. And when the frequency changes, the quantum field no longer offers you the same experiences. If, while reading these lines, you feel an indescribable yes feeling, it comes not from belief, but from remembrance, because consciousness recognizes information that belongs to it when it sees it. This video has come to you because your field of consciousness has expanded to the point where it can no longer carry old cycles and has made room for a new possibility. This moment doesn't have to be a great enlightenment. Sometimes transformation begins with just a quiet realization. But all you need to know is this. This encounter is not accidental. And whether you are aware of it or not, you have already begun to cross a threshold. And what is expected of you as you cross this threshold is not to do anything, not to force anything. All that is expected of you is to notice what is. Because when quantum consciousness begins to work, effort takes a back seat, awareness comes to the forefront. You no longer transform life by pushing it, but by observing it. That's why some days your mind slows down, even empties. Some moments feel as if time is expanding. These are not signs of loss, but of resynchronization. As your consciousness aligns with a broader reality, it lets go of its old speed, its old rhythm, and its old fears. That's why making hasty decisions, clinging to your old identity, or immediately wanting to return to your old self, at this stage only delays the process. Because this call comes not for quick answers but for deep harmony. And the moment you feel this harmony, you silently know that nothing will ever be the same again. At this point, it's important not to try to name or immediately understand this process, because quantum consciousness shrinks the moment it's labeled. When the mind asks, "What's happening?" consciousness only observes. And it is precisely in this observational state that you realize your old identity is now too restrictive. As the adjectives, roles, and stories that once defined you slowly dissolve, an emptiness that you cannot yet name takes its place. Although this emptiness is perceived as a void, it is actually the birthplace of a new reality, and the more silently you can remain within this space, the clearer the transformation becomes. When quantum consciousness awakens, the brain resetting isn't a sign of malfunction or weakness. Rather, It's the result of the brain honestly accepting a level of perception it can no longer handle. Because the brain, by its nature, loves security and continuity. It repeats what it knows, protects what it recognizes, and perceives uncertainty as a threat. However, when consciousness expands, that is, when you reach a level of awareness where you can no longer continue living with the same thought patterns, the same reactions, and the same internal automatic programs, the brain begins to struggle to run the existing software. At this point, the process we call reset spontaneously kicks in. Thoughts don't feel as powerful as before. Some emotions become meaningless, and sometimes even a feeling of mental emptiness or disorientation arises. This is interpreted by many as confusion, loss of motivation, or loss of control. However, what's actually happening is that the brain can't explain a new reality with its old maps, because at the quantum level, reality is not linear, and when consciousness begins to move in the realm of probability, the brain cannot follow this flow with the classical cause and effect chain. That's why the reset occurs. The brain's internal GPS, which constantly guides you down the same paths, experiences a signal loss. The familiar reactions no longer come automatically. The fears that used to motivate you are no longer as convincing, and this gives you a strange feeling of neutrality. But this neutrality isn't a pause, it's a readjustment phase. The brain learns here, but not in the old ways. It learns to observe, not to react. At this stage, you also begin to realize, not all your thoughts are yours, not all your feelings are you, and not every internal impulse needs to be followed. This awareness shuts down the brain's automatic defense mechanisms, because there is no longer an old self to defend. This is why the reset process is unsettling. As the identity dissolves, a gap that is not yet fully defined takes its place. The mind perceives this gap as emptiness, while consciousness perceives it as potential. That's why people say, "I don't feel like I used to," during this period. The correct expression is, you no longer just feel, you become aware. And when awareness begins, the brain can no longer keep you on autopilot. As the reset completes, inner silence increases, the spaces between thoughts widen, and for the first time you begin to exist not with your mind, but with your consciousness. This process is not quick and cannot be forced, because the reset happens not when you allow it, but when you are ready. The brain withdraws here, consciousness takes the lead, and the real transformation begins precisely in this shift. One of the most noticeable changes experienced in this phase is that the mind can no longer constantly occupy you. The internal dialogues that used to flow automatically slow down, and sometimes even stop completely, and this silence may initially be perceived as uncertainty rather than peace. However, this uncertainty does not stem from a lack of direction, but from a shift in direction from inside to outside. The brain no longer tries to control life, because it begins to realize that there is no flow to control, only a space to harmonize with. At this point, the reset becomes not an end, but the clearest indication that consciousness is beginning to synchronize with a new reality. The biggest mistake most people make in this process is misinterpreting this mental stillness they experience. Because society has taught us to constantly think, plan, and keep the mind active. However, as you progress through quantum consciousness, you don't lose anything when the mind falls silent. On the contrary, a real field of perception opens up for the first time. As the brain withdraws, intuitive awareness strengthens, and instead of trying to solve things, you begin to see them as they are. This leads you to a point where you make less effort but more accurate choices. This is precisely where the reset becomes meaningful. The mind is no longer the leader, but merely a tool. And this role reversal forms the basis for a radical transformation of your relationship with life. When the observer cycle is broken, what happens is not a dramatic enlightenment or a sudden burst of happiness. Rather, it is a quiet but profound sense of displacement. This is because many recurring experiences in a person's life stem not from external circumstances, but from consistently viewing things from the same point of view at a conscious level. As long as you view from the same place, the quantum field offers you the same possibilities. This is precisely what the observer cycle is. The unconscious transmission of the same frequency, and the repeated experience of the same reality. However, when this cycle is broken, the first thing noticed is not a change in the external world, but the meaninglessness of your reactions to it. Words, events, or people that used to trigger you no longer have the same effect, because the observer is no longer in their old position. This situation causes a strange feeling of alienation in most people. It's as if life continues to flow, but you are watching from a step behind. In fact, this withdrawal is not a regression, but a higher state of consciousness that we call meta-observation. You are no longer someone lost in the experience, but begin to become a consciousness that notices the experience. At this point, the perception of time also changes. Some moments are intense, while others feel almost as if time has stopped, because time is not a fixed line, but an experience that stretches with consciousness. When the observer cycle is broken, the brain still searches for old reference points, but cannot find them. This is why the feeling of something is changing in my life, but I don't quite know what, arises. What is actually happening is this: you are no longer energizing the same set of possibilities. As your attention shifts from fear to awareness, the quantum field begins to open up new scenarios for you. These scenarios are not always comfortable, because as consciousness expands, old identities lose their ground. Some relationships dissolve spontaneously, some goals subtly diminish, and these losses are initially perceived as emptiness. However, this emptiness is the clearest sign that the cycle has been broken, because before the cycle is broken, it seems full of life but is mechanical. After the cycle is broken, it simplifies but is alive. You no longer allow events to drag you along. You observe them, and observation is the most powerful influence at the quantum level. Another thing you realize at this stage is that many things you thought were coincidences are actually natural reflections of your state of consciousness. People, opportunities, and even challenges begin to align with you on the same frequency. This doesn't create a sense of control. On the contrary, it brings surrender and trust, because you now know that you transform reality not by forcing it, but by observing it from the right perspective. When the observer cycle is broken, life changes not because it's easier, but because it's more honest. Masks fall, illusions dissolve, and for the first time, you begin to hear your own inner voice in a noise-free space. This voice doesn't tell you what to do. It only reminds you of what you are not, and this remembrance is the irreversible threshold of the journey of consciousness. The most subtle yet powerful change noticed at this stage is that choices are no longer made through mental coercion. While making a decision used to require hours of thinking, pros and cons, and internal conflicts. When the observer cycle is broken, choices come from a quieter place. You don't decide. The decision becomes clear. This situation might initially be perceived as passivity, but what's actually happening is that consciousness no longer produces chaos. As the mind quiets, possibilities become clearer, and you understand which direction to move in, not by thinking, but by feeling. This feeling is an indicator of harmony in the quantum field, because when consciousness is at the right frequency, it doesn't exert effort. Resistance disappears, and the flow regulates itself spontaneously. At this stage, an inner clarity begins to emerge. However, this clarity manifests itself not through answers, but through the loss of importance of questions. Questions that used to occupy your mind, such as, why did it happen? How will it happen? What if it doesn't? Gradually dissolve, giving way to calm acceptance. This acceptance is not surrender, but awareness, because you now know that every experience is lived not to make you feel incomplete, but to expand your field of consciousness. When the observer cycle is broken, life doesn't try to prove anything to you, nor do you need to prove yourself to life. This state of balance is one of the quietest yet most powerful manifestations of quantum consciousness. The reset moment isn't a collapse, a disappearance, or a detachment from life as many people imagine. However, it's natural to feel that way at first glance, because when the mind loses the familiar noise, it perceives it as emptiness. Yet, this silence is the moment when consciousness begins to surface with its own weight for the first time. The thoughts, plans, fears, and expectations that once preoccupied you gradually lose their influence. Life goes on, but your way of connecting with it has changed. At this point, some people say, "I feel nothing," while others describe it as, "It's like I'm empty inside." What's actually happening is this: the brain stops the internal noise it constantly has to produce, and consciousness inserts an unfiltered space. This space is initially unsettling because the human mind feels safe with content, not emptiness. However, at the quantum level, creation occurs precisely in this emptiness. The silence at the reset moment is a sign that your old identity no longer has a foothold. The roles, goals, and even emotions that once defined you begin to lose their meaning. This situation might be perceived as a loss, because the mind thinks, the things that make me who I am are leaving. But for consciousness, this is not a loss, but a process of lightening. As the silence deepens, the demands of the outside world are heard from afar. Matters that once felt urgent lose their importance. This is not a loss of interest in life. It is a more direct contact with life, because when the noise decreases, perception sharpens. Time also feels different at the moment of reset. Some days flow very slowly, while other moments pass almost in an instant. This is not a distortion of time, but a dissolution of consciousness's dependence on time. The mind wants to measure time, while consciousness experiences it. When this difference emerges, the feeling of emptiness begins to give way to clarity. Silence no longer feels like a threat. On the contrary, it becomes a refuge. The biggest mistake at this stage is trying to quickly fill this void. Creating new goals, new pursuits, new identities is an old habit of the mind. However, the moment of reset exists not to be filled, but to be heard. When you can remain in this silence, consciousness begins to show you a new direction. But this direction comes not with words, but with feeling. It's not that something has gone wrong, but rather that something has finally fallen into place. The space you perceive as emptiness is actually a realm of possibility. Quantum consciousness can only shape a new reality when it simplifies to this extent. The reset moment is therefore a critical threshold. Those who rush return to old cycles, while those who allow silence move to an entirely new level of perception. There are no dramatic signs, no grand pronouncements in this transition, only a profound stillness. And this stillness is the most powerful form of rebirth of consciousness. The most frequent question a person asks themselves in this phase is, "What should I do now?" But the nature of the reset moment is not to answer this question, because the greatest action to be taken at this stage is inaction. The mind seeks solutions, while consciousness aligns. As the silence lengthens, a sense of inner confidence gradually emerges. This confidence is an inexplicable but unshakable foundation. Independent of external conditions, you realize not that you no longer need to control life, but that you never truly controlled it. This realization doesn't create fear, but rather relief. Because the burden of responsibility lightens, the need to struggle is resolved, and for the first time you begin to feel that life flows with you, not against you. And it is precisely at this point that you understand that silence is not actually an absence, but a language. This language does not speak with words. It manifests itself through feelings, intuitions, and instantaneous awareness. Those who can hear this language at the moment of reset do not return to their old lives, because there is nowhere left to return to. Emptiness is no longer perceived as a feared space, but as the purest state of consciousness. The longer you can remain in this space, the clearer the new reality becomes. Because in the quantum field, creation begins not in noise, but in silence. Another important change noticed in this silence is the dissolution of the need for external validation. While being understood, seen, or validated used to seem vital, these expectations slowly melt away at the moment of reset. Because when consciousness stops defining itself from the outside, an inner sense of self-sufficiency emerges. What others think or feel no longer determines your inner balance. This detachment is not a cooling off, but a maturation. Silence doesn't distance you from people. It brings you closer to yourself, and this closeness forms the most solid foundation of your new reality. After a reset, life doesn't miraculously change overnight. On the contrary, everything continues to seem quite ordinary from the outside. However, because your internal point of reference has fundamentally changed, the same life now takes on a completely different meaning. The construction of the new reality begins precisely here, because quantum consciousness shapes reality not with external conditions, but with internal alignment. You no longer act with the question of what should be, but with the feeling of, what am I in harmony with? This difference is very subtle but crucial. While you used to think that your goals propelled you forward, now you realize that the real guiding factor is your frequency. Where your attention is directed becomes more important than your thoughts, because attention is the purest form of energy in the quantum field. The new reality is built not with grand decisions, but with small but clear choices. Which thought you nurture, which emotion you dwell on, which experience you rewatch. Each of these leaves a trace in the realm of possibility. In this phase, life teaches you not to achieve by force, but to progress by alignment. You no longer try to keep up with everything, because not everything belongs to you. You become selective. This selectivity stems not from arrogance, but from awareness. You intuitively begin to discern which relationships expand you, and which only perpetuate your old identity. Some doors close on their own. You don't force them. Some opportunities appear exactly when you need them. You don't chase them. This is the natural order of the new reality. There is no control, but there is no chaos either. Instead, there is a quiet flow. The brain still wants to reactivate old habits from time to time. Past fears, future scenarios remind themselves. But these thoughts no longer drag you along. You notice them and allow them to pass. This state of allowing is not passivity. It is a conscious stance. The new reality doesn't have to make you more successful, but it makes you clearer, because you clearly know what you don't want. What you will harmonize with emerges naturally. At this stage, the greatest change is seen in your relationship with life. Life ceases to be a force opposing you. It becomes a space where you move together. You no longer forcibly shape possibilities. You resonate with them, and when resonance is established, results become visible effortlessly. The construction of the new reality is not noisy. It doesn't need to be proven to anyone. It's not loudly proclaimed. It takes root silently. You experience it not as progress, but as a feeling of falling into place. Because life no longer constantly forces you to be someone else, you begin to open up from where you are, from the frequency you are at. And this opening is the most tangible manifestation of quantum consciousness. One of the most noticeable differences that catches your attention in this new phase is the increase in synchronizations in your life. People, information, and experiences no longer scatter randomly. They appear exactly when you need them, exactly where they should be. This may surprise you, even unsettle you at times, because the mind struggles to explain such a fluid order. But consciousness doesn't need explanation. You simply notice. And as you notice, the communication between you and the quantum field becomes clearer. At this point, the concept of luck loses its meaning, because you intuitively know that what you are experiencing are natural reflections of inner alignment. Another significant shift in building the new reality is the diminished need for struggle. While you used to think you had to resist, push yourself, or constantly prove yourself for things to happen, you now realize that as resistance decreases, progress accelerates. This isn't a retreat. It's letting go of unnecessary burdens. Consciousness no longer strives for more, but for more authenticity. This authenticity takes you less to heart, but creates a deeper sense of fulfillment. Many things in your life become simpler, but this simplification doesn't diminish. It clarifies. And at this point, you fully understand that the new reality is actually built not in the external world, but in your perception. The world is the same world. People are the same people. The only thing that changes is how you look at them. When this perspective changes, life no longer tests you, it recognizes you. You begin to see life not as a field to be conquered, but as a field of consciousness to be experienced. The building of the new reality is thus not completed. On the contrary, it continues silently and anew every moment. Because in quantum consciousness, to exist is not about reaching a conclusion, but about remaining in a constant state of harmony. At this point, the real question is no longer what you've learned, but how you'll live with this awareness. Because any information that comes into contact with quantum consciousness cannot remain merely a mental understanding. It is either integrated into life or loses its effect over time. This information is not an answer, it's a threshold, and every threshold requires choice. Returning to the old cycle is always possible. The mind knows this path well, finds it safe, and offers you familiar arguments. It whispers phrases like, "You felt this way for a while. That's just how life is. Don't delve too deep." But once consciousness expands, it can no longer be confined to narrow molds. You have now become aware, and awareness is an irreversible experience. Therefore, the question of what you will do with this information is actually the question of what state of consciousness you will choose to remain in. You look at your life and you see this. You can no longer relate to everything in the same way. Some conversations seem superficial. Some goals become meaningless. Some struggles seem unnecessary. This is not a break. This is an increase in selectivity. Consciousness doesn't distribute its energy everywhere. It gravitates towards where there is depth. The biggest mistake at this stage is to turn this awareness into a form of superiority or escape. Because quantum consciousness teaches you to connect more directly with life, not to distance yourself from it. You no longer try to fix life. You begin to read it. You sense the patterns behind what's happening, the recurring themes, and the points where it calls you to grow. This intuition guides but doesn't force. It doesn't offer a roadmap. It becomes a compass. And the compass shows you the direction, not the speed. Therefore, you don't rush. You don't need everything to happen immediately. Because your relationship with time changes, waiting no longer creates impatience. Waiting becomes part of the alignment process. Living with this knowledge doesn't mean being at a high frequency every moment. It means staying centered despite fluctuations. You don't blame yourself when you struggle. You don't feel like a failure when you retreat. Because you know that the journey of consciousness is not linear. Expansion and calming progress in cycles. Your task is not to manage these cycles, but to recognize them and move with them. And this is precisely where maintaining your connection with this field becomes important, because consciousness is nourished not only individually, but also collectively. If you want to deepen this perspective, stay on this frequency, and maintain contact with this kind of content. Subscribing to this channel means not only accessing new videos, but also consciously engaging with this field of consciousness. This is not a call, but an invitation. Because this information is not for everyone. It is for those who are ready. And if you are here, you already know that this preparation has already begun. As you continue to live with this awareness, you will realize that life doesn't constantly expect clear answers from you. On the contrary, it demands honest attention. The courage to see things as they are, without denying what you feel or glorifying what you think. This courage is the simplest practice of quantum consciousness in daily life. You no longer feel the need to constantly improve yourself, because you have realized that you are not lacking. Development ceases to be a necessity and becomes a natural side effect. Transformation deepens not as you try to change, but as you connect with who you are. At this point, relationships also take on a different dimension. You don't try to change people. You don't expect anything from them. You see more clearly who they are and adjust your distance accordingly. This distance isn't coldness, it's a conscious boundary. The need to explain everything to everyone disappears, because being understood is no longer something demanded from the outside. When you hear yourself, the silence of others doesn't bother you. This opens up a space for you to build calmer, more balanced, and more genuine connections. And over time, you realize this. This knowledge didn't make you someone else. It brought you closer to who you are. Life is no longer a battleground, but a field of experience where consciousness is engaged. Every moment doesn't have to teach a lesson. Some moments are simply meant to be lived. Instead of assigning meaning to these moments, you learn to pass through them. This is the quietest yet most enduring manifestation of quantum consciousness in daily life. Because true transformation is not completed when it is noticed, but when you learn to live with it. If this video reminded you of anything, don't dismiss it as a coincidence. Subscribe to our channel to stay on this frequency, and simply write in the comments below, "I am aligned with quantum consciousness." 40ao.Courting by Maine.